Hello and welcome to St Michael's Chapel for our Dwell service. It's really good to join you in this way. And welcome whether you're watching this service with us live on Wednesday morning or perhaps watching it at a later point when convenient to you. Whichever way, it's really good to join you. We call this service Dwell because we are aware of the way in which churches and chapels, other places of prayer, are a place for us to dwell with God, to be in God's presence. And the Bible speaks of the temple, of other places, as well as a dwelling place for God. And of course, of God's people being a dwelling place for God. So we hope that in this short time we spend together, that you will find a place to dwell with God and that you become aware of God's presence. In our Dwell service, one of the ways in which we particularly prepare ourselves or help ourselves to be aware of God's presence is by becoming aware of our breath, of our breathing. It's a technique used in many spiritual traditions as a way of stilling and centering ourselves. And in many ways it's very simple because the breath is already there. And the key thing is just for us to take time to be aware of it. So I invite us now at this point to take a moment to become aware of our breathing, of how the breath is entering and leaving the body. Just to be aware of the in-breath and the out-breath. So let's take a moment to do that now. It's an interesting fact of nature that our breath connects us to the world around us. As we breathe out, plants and trees take in some of what we breathe out, and in turn, we then take in some of what they put back into the atmosphere. So our breath connects us to the world around us, as well as connecting different parts of ourselves, our mind, our body, and our spirit. And prayer and the breath are closely linked. In many faith traditions, prayer is sometimes linked to the pattern of breathing. And the Bible talks of God's Spirit in the same words that it uses for speaking about the breath of the body. So I invite you to continue to be aware of your breath for a few moments longer. And in a moment I'm going to sound the singing bowl, just striking it with this wooden mallet. And as the note fades away, and I'll try and strike it well enough for that to happen, I invite you to follow that note as it fades into silence. And then it will lead us just into a few more moments of stillness. The Old Testament theologian Walter Brueggemann says this about the Psalms. In season and out of season, generation after generation, faithful women and men turn to the Psalms as a most helpful resource for conversation with God about things that matter most. Today, we're going to explore something of the importance of the Psalms in terms of how we relate to God and also to the people and events in our lives. And I'm delighted that Paul Smith, my friend and colleague, reader at St Michael's, is going to help us to explore those ideas as he brings us our readings and reflections shortly in our service. So we're now going to hear our short opening prayer, which is taken from Tess Ward's book, The Celtic Wheel of the Year. Blessed be you, caller into being, who breaks into our daily doing and speaks our names within the heart. Let us hear your voice as we rise up and follow the Spirit this day. Amen. We're now going to hear the first of our hymns. And our first hymn is Angel Voices Ever Sing. And so now Paul is going to read our first Bible reading for us.
From the book of Psalms, Psalm number 1. Blessed is the one who does not walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night. That person is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, and whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers. Not so the wicked. They are like chaff that the wind blows away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord watches over the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked leads to destruction. The book of Psalms includes about 135 examples of things you can say to God. They offer many varied examples of about 4 ways of speaking to God that also correspond to ways human beings speak to one another. First, we say to God and to one another, "You are great." Psalm 8 is a convenient example. It begins, "O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth." Second, we say to God and to one another, "Help." Psalm 3 begins, "O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying to me, there is no help for you in God." Sometimes we may feel less desperate whether or not the situation actually is less desperate. Thus, a third way of speaking to God and to one another is to say, "I trust you." Psalm 23 is an example. Such a psalm belongs to the kind of context in life where you're walking through a valley characterized by deathly shadow and surrounded by enemies. But it expresses a confidence that God will protect and deliver. And finally, we have the experience of God or the other person taking action to deal with our situation. Then naturally we say to God and to one another, "Thank you." Psalm 30 is an example. It begins, "I will exalt you, Lord, for you lifted me out of the depths and did not let my enemies gloat over me. Lord my God, I called to you for help and you healed me." So these 4 types of psalms are all words spoken to God rather than by God. So Psalm 1, which we just heard, believes in the importance of choice. It believes that the key choice we have to make is enormously important, but also believes that it is straightforward. The fact that the Psalter begins with this psalm reminds us that the life of worship and prayer on which the Psalter focuses can't be separated from living life in the light of God's teaching. You can't expect to worship or pray if you're not living by that teaching.
Thank you, Paul, and we'll hear some more reflection on the Psalms in a few moments. Now we're going to hear our second hymn, which is "All Heaven Declares." Now, Paul will bring us our second Bible reading and reflection.
Our second psalm is one that's very familiar to everyone, Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Very familiar words. Coronavirus, COVID-19, is impacting all of us, both as individuals and communities. The very fabric of everyday life is changing before us. In the midst of this, we're invited to find God. We reflect on Psalm 23 and its implications for our lives now more than ever. Today, it's easy to feel that we now indeed are walking through the darkest valley and that there is no end in sight. But as everything with God, we're invited towards greater trust and in the process experience more hope, peace and beauty in the midst of suffering. Walter Brueggemann, who Simon mentioned earlier in his book The Message of the Psalms, categorises all psalms into one of three movements: orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. Each of these movements exemplify a fragment of the human experience. Orientation, when everything feels right and content in our lives. Disorientation, when life feels difficult, dark and broken. Reorientation, when God pulls us out of the brokenness of life and we're brought to a deeper sense of awareness and gratitude. Brueggemann argues that we go through rhythms of orientation to disorientation to reorientation. It's part of the natural human experience. This is the beauty of Psalm 23, and perhaps why it's become one of the most famous passages in human history. In this psalm, all three movements exist. Psalm 23 is a compilation of the entire rhythm of the human experience. The first three verses are of orientation. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Life is good, happy, blessed. The Lord provides us with lush green pastures and refreshing waters. Verse 4 suggests disorientation, the darkest valley, a description of the trauma and suffering we go through as humans and communities. Then in verse 4, there is reorientation, the sort that declares, for you are with me. There is an expression of trust and confidence in the presence of God in spite of suffering. These are uncertain times. The future feels out of our control. In many ways, we've just moved from orientation to disorientation. But we are invited towards reorientation. We're invited into the natural rhythm of the human experience to move from disorientation to reorientation and to declare, for you are with me.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. We now come to our time of reflection, to which we have been led by the reflections that Paul has offered us this morning. So we'll take a couple of minutes to think about the things that we've heard in our service so far. And I offer a question which you might find helpful to guide your thoughts. Is there something going on in my life which the Psalms could help me bring to God? Is there something going on in my life which the Psalms could help me bring to God? So some time for us to reflect on that question and the thoughts that arise from it. Now we come to our time of prayer. And in this time of prayer, I'll offer some very brief guidelines for the things that we might want to offer to God in prayer this morning. And then after each one, I'll simply leave space for our own prayers. So let us prepare ourselves for the day ahead of us and see the potential that God offers to us. We begin by bringing to God the concerns of this day. Now we bring to God the people of this day. We bring ourselves to God. Lord, Give us wisdom before we speak, understanding while we listen, sensitivity towards those we meet, and the perspective of your kingdom in which to see the things of earth. Bring us to the day's ending, blessed through having shared in this day's beginning. In the name of Christ we ask this. Amen. Now we hear our final hymn, which in many ways is a prayer to help us through each stage of the day. The hymn, Be Thou My Vision. Thank you for joining in this service. I hope that you found a place to dwell here today and that you might be able to join us again soon. And so now we hear our closing prayer. O Divine One, whose sole purpose is love, tune our attention to a simple mindfulness and let the distractions fall away, that we might walk this day with thankfulness for every step. Be with each of us when we become overwhelmed by our own making, or because of our situation, or when we cannot tell the difference. And give us faith that the unfolding of your love each day is the goal of the journey.